We started off the show today. I was asking you about what you thought of Minister Pierre Fitzgibbon's announcement today that there are too many cars on the road and he's not going to do anything about it. And when I say he, I mean the provincial government's not. Instead, he's thrown it to the municipalities for them to decide what they want to do. And part of what they can do next year effectively will be to add their own registration tax for public transit. So we don't know what that's going to be, but it will be available for them as of next year. All this made me think, and I saw an article, this is going back a couple of days ago, and thought, with all this talk about electric cars, right, you'd think that if you could, and yes, they're still very expensive for the most part, but you think if you could afford one, you'd buy one. And after reading this article, I thought, well, that would not necessarily be the best decision for everyone, even if you could afford one. Bassam Javed is a PhD candidate and researcher at UBC. He is on the line. Bassam, thanks so much for being with us.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Let me talk about this because I think this is important. And I know your research conducted in BC, so it's specific to conditions there. But I would imagine it's the same basically everywhere if you are considering buying an electric car. So explain what your methodology here. What were you looking to do?
Yeah, look, a big question on a lot of consumers' minds these days is how much does it actually cost to own an electric vehicle in Canada? And so what our study kind of set out to do and what we found is that, it turns out that the total cost of owning an EV actually varies quite a bit across Canada, depending on both where you live and also how you live. We looked at a number of different factors and depending on, which province you live in and also the amount that you drive every day, it might make sense for you to have an EV right now, or it may not make a whole lot of financial sense.
Okay, so let's go through that. With respect of it not making a lot of financial sense, the argument we typically hear is it's less expensive to run an EV than it is a combustion engine car. As you said in this study, not necessarily the case. So explain where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so if we look at a typical comparison that most people are used to, right? So if you compare a vehicle that's the exact same in both a gasoline and an electric. So for instance, let's take the Hyundai Kona. You've got an electric version and a gasoline version. The gasoline version costs about $25,000, give or take, in its sticker price, and the EV costs about $45,000, give or take, depending on the trim. If you kind of compare those two, depending on where you live in Canada, the EV can cost, in Quebec, it could cost about $2,000 more over a period of 7 years, whereas in places like Nunavut, it could cost about $18,000 more. So it really does depend quite a bit depending on where you live in Canada.
Okay, so let's deal with big cities. I understand that, depending on where you live that way, it can cost a whole lot more in one place than another. But let's say you're in a major Canadian city, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, and then it's a matter of how you'll be using that car. What did you discover?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you kind of mentioned, the economics of an EV kind of really shine through because they're cheaper to run, right? They're more expensive upfront, but they're cheaper to run for a number of different reasons. So what that kind of translates to is the more you drive, the better it is on your economics of your EV. Now, take that with a grain of salt. We're not actually saying go out and drive a whole lot more, but what it's actually telling us is that for folks that are already driving a lot, it already makes a lot of sense. So for instance, the same comparison that I just sort of gave you before, the Hyundai Kona versus the Hyundai Kona, if you're living in Quebec, it would take you about 46 kilometers of driving per day for those two vehicles to equal value after about 7 years. And the reason why we say 7 years, because that's about the average amount of time that most Canadians hang on to their vehicles.
Okay, I want you to explain that again. You're saying it would take, if you're driving 46 kilometers a day, net, it's the same thing at the end of 7 years?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So if you're driving 46 kilometers a day, which in Quebec is actually not far off from the average amount that most people drive, according to the latest StatsCan data we have, drivers in Quebec are traveling about 41 kilometers per day on average. So it's actually not quite a bit far off. We think it's actually a little bit more now. The data is a little bit out of date from StatsCan, so we actually think it's a little bit more. Drivers are actually probably pretty close to that 46-kilometer mark, if not doing a little bit more in Quebec.
So again, because I think that's interesting, people hearing this thinking, I thought I'd save a whole lot more money. So if you're only driving, let's say you're doing city commutes, for example, right, and you're doing actually less than 46 kilometers a day, would you be ahead of the kind of curve here at the end of 7 years with a gas-powered car?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're driving more, you're obviously saving quite a bit more. But where it really shines through is when you kind of look at a different comparison, right? The one that most people are used to, like I said, is that apples-to-apples comparison, which is actually not how most consumers shop. So, for this, we can kind of walk through an example. Let's say if I'm a consumer and I go to the dealership, right? And let's say I've got about $500 to $700 in car payments that I can make which is about the average amount that most Canadians have. With that amount, I could either buy, let's say, the most popular selling car in Canada, a Toyota RAV4, a gasoline car, or I could buy a Hyundai Kona electric. Both of them are around $45,000 sticker price. With the EV, I actually start saving right off the lot. As soon as I drive it off the lot, because it's cheaper to run, I'm starting to save a lot of money. And depending on where you live, you can actually save tens of thousands of dollars more after 7 years.
Okay. So again, I'm thinking though, if you're that person living in the big city and you're commuting 30, 40 kilometers a day, even at the end of 7 years, if it all works out, and you're net zero, you haven't saved anything, it hasn't cost you more to drive one versus the other. People will point out the fact that, well, what you're not taking into account is repairs, because we understand they're a lot less, they would be on an EV than they would be on a gas-powered car. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a number of studies and a lot of evidence to kind of suggest what are the different maintenance costs. We did take those into account. So all of the numbers that I'm giving you actually take into account the maintenance costs of EVs as well as for gasoline vehicles as well. We also take into account the salvage value as well. So folks, selling their car at the end of 7 years, we also take into account the latest data that we have available on, how much it costs to sell a gasoline car versus an electric car, how much value they hold.
So after doing all this work and doing this research, if you were in the market to buy a car, what would you buy?
Well, I actually happen to own an EV myself. I drive a Chrysler Pacific hybrid. I actually did the math myself well before I did this study. It made a lot of sense for me because I drive quite a bit on a daily basis. And so that's why I ended up purchasing an EV.
Okay.
We then turned it into a study because we thought it was something that, all Canadians should kind of know about.
There is one other thing, and I've heard this as well. I don't know if it concerns necessarily all electric cars, but at some point people have brought up this idea that, after X number of years, let's say you hold on to your car for longer than 7 years or you do an awful lot of mileage, there's a concern about what happens to the battery. Do they eventually have to be replaced? Is that a big cost? What is that about?
Yeah, so there's definitely a concern that's raised about batteries. And, there's a couple of things I can point out here. And that's the first thing is that batteries that are currently on the market today, so the current slate of EVs that are coming out, they're actually quite a bit better than, those first Nissan Leafs that we saw in early 2010s. Those, there's lots of stories. We hear a lot of anecdotes of, having to do very expensive battery replacements on those. But the new EVs that are coming out now, they tend to be able to retain a usable battery capacity for generally well over what most consumers are able to drive in 7 years.
Which begs the question, if you're not going to buy a new EV, but consider buying a used one, you really should know how long it's been on the road and what state that battery is in, should you not?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of dealerships these days will offer a battery health test. This is kind of a good way. Even, many manufacturers will have it right on the dashboard as well when you turn your car on. There's some diagnostics that you can run right on the dashboard that'll tell you what the state of health of your battery is. And there's a lot of, information out there on the internet from some very reputable sources that will kind of give you some guidance on what's kind of that threshold of the state of health of battery that's okay to purchase.
I should point out as well, when you say you take all these factors into consideration, obviously rebates vary from province to province and federally. We know here in Quebec, we're about to see ours go down next year and then go down again to zero by the year after that. That's taken into consideration, right, Bassam, when you've done this study. So you should also perhaps consider that once those are gone, it gets even more expensive, I would imagine, to own that car. Or do manufacturers then decide, well, we don't have that anymore, so we'll just bring our costs down? Have you figured that out?
Yeah, so when we did the study, obviously the news about Quebec sort of phasing out the subsidies by 2027, this is sort of breaking news from just last week. We didn't incorporate that into the study. A couple of things that I'll point out here. One is that, electricity prices are actually the cheapest in Quebec, and that's actually one of the biggest driving factors across Canada, how the cost of EVs vary. Because of that favorable electricity price, EVs are still favorable in Quebec. The other thing I would mention is that subsidies are still available, and so if there are consumers out there that are considering purchasing an EV, and if there are ones that are driving, kind of close to that 45, 46 kilometer mark, then it's probably something worth considering while the subsidies are still available. The other thing that we'll also start seeing, as we move towards the 2035 mandate for 100% zero emissions vehicle sales in that year, we'll ideally start to see more mass market EVs in that are available for consumers at that point in time than subsidies may not really be necessary.
Right. Including, we're told, some from China, right? They're really revving up their EV market as well. They could be coming to Canada if they're not going to be here soon. I mean, eventually.
Yeah, I was just reading an article yesterday from Bloomberg that, these super cheap Chinese EVs. So this is actually a big factor. A lot of the legacy OEMs or automakers that are, present in North America are starting to actually worry about these really cheap Chinese EVs that could come in. The jury's out on how that will sort of play out. But where we are headed, we can kind of generally say is that EVs will likely become cheaper than they are right now.
All right. Hey, I want to thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for the information and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, Bassam Javed, there you go. That's a UBC study, that magic number, 46 kilometers. If you do more than that, better off with an EV. If you do less, not necessarily.